Okay, so first off, I apologise if my voice is a little bit low. My little boy's in bed. It's late at night, hence the jimmies. I'm in my pyjamas right now. But I wanted to comment. I just watched a Hangout, Kristi Winters' response to Sargon and Picard, and they were talking about the regressive left and trying to define what people mean when they use that term. And that's kind of interesting because I stumbled across that term a few months ago now, and its kind of usage just went sort of exponential there. And they were trying to define how it was used and what people mean by it, and I really wanted to chime in on that, so I kind of felt compelled to come to my computer and say something, which is what I'm doing now. So there's a guy there from, I think, the Skeptic Fence channel who's on there, who had a name, and I'm kind of not wanting to say his name because I'm sure I've got it wrong. It sounds a little bit outrageous. He something, it sounded to me like Russian dead Pole, right? Like Russian dead Polish person. I don't know if that is what he calls himself, or if that's totally out of line what I've said there. I don't know, but that's what it sounded like, Russian dead Pole. So he said, quite interesting and very factual, and I'm sure he's absolutely watertight on what he said. He said that Majid Nawaz had coined this term to describe those people who, although they will try and champion minorities, in a bid to champion minorities, end up not championing minorities within minorities. So if you looked at an ethnic minority like an Islamic community in the West, you might actually leave women or atheists or whatever, you might hang them out to dry. And we can all give examples. He gave some examples of that. And yeah, we can all understand that, the ways in which we've all seen examples in that over the years. So I kind of got that, and I don't want to draw anything away from what he said there. But then other people started to chime in and come up with other examples of what they think people actually mean when they say it. So that's where I kind of got drawn into that. And when I first heard the term, it kind of appealed to me as a term. A lot of these terms turned me off straight away, but this was one particular term which, when I heard it, I thought it was kind of clever, really, and but it quickly lost its luster because it was just so over applied in such a short space of time. Everybody just became it lost that appeal because it was just applied to anybody. It just became another pejorative term, and I've never actually used it. But I've kind of monitored its use, and what I would suggest is that rather than, obviously that is a correct context to use it, but the context in which it often seems to have been used seems to be in this context of pointing towards people who are left-wing and who would regard themselves as progressive, but who, the way in which they enact, in which they manifest their progressivism, is employing tactics which end up being the kind of things which otherwise they would regard as regressive. So, for example, they may create safe spaces which end up being racially or ethnically segregating. And under normal circumstances, that would be the very last thing that they would accept, right? Because those things would be allied to racism, but for some reason, when they're doing it, they regard that as acceptable. So it's almost like kind of stepping backwards. Things that normally they would regard as objectionable, they now find as okay. Another example might be punching up. Which sounds kind of okay, you're hitting up at power, but if you think of kind of these kind of ideas of standpoint theory and not being able, everybody having their own perspectives, not telling people what the other perspectives is, and understanding that you can't necessarily appreciate somebody else's perspective, and that's all well and good, it seems, when it's people who are minority groups and oppressed groups, but it seems that when it comes to stockbrokers or the rich and famous, we're all fucking experts, aren't we? We can all appreciate the pressures that a stockbroker under and then dismiss them out of hand. Of course we can't any more than we could with a group that traditionally would be seen as under pressure, but it seems that different rules apply. Or perhaps the biggest one for me would be this idea of positive discrimination, which is the idea of practices that would otherwise be seen as discriminatory on the grounds of gender, sex, sexuality, or race is perhaps the biggest one in the United States, are suddenly acceptable in a bid to end some kind of historical inequity. So effectively somebody was discriminated against 20 years ago, so in a bid to rectify that, we're going to now discriminate against somebody else today. Of course, discrimination is always experienced. It might be institutional, it might be systemic, but it's always experienced by individuals, and so I always find it objectionable because effectively you're trying to create a right through two entirely separate wrongs, and I don't see how that's ever going to work. Of course, in Europe, that kind of thing is illegal. You can't do that kind of thing. It is regarded, there's no such thing as reverse racism. It's all racism. There's no such thing as acceptable discrimination other than discriminating on characteristics that are relevant to whatever it is you're doing. You know, if you want a plumber, you can discriminate on the grounds of how good somebody is as a plumber, but not on the grounds of ethnic characteristics or anything like that, to make up for the fact that 20 years back, I don't know, Jewish plumbers were discriminated against or any bullshit like that, right? So those are the kind of things that I think most people were referring to at first, in the general sort of sense of the word, not in the specific sense that this Russian Dead Powell guy, if that is what he's called, was talking about. But it was to refer to people that would regard themselves as progressive, doing things which, if they saw it in anybody else, they would regard it, or any other context, they would regard that as regressive behaviour. But for some reason, when they do it for their ends, now that's okay. So I think that's what I wanted to add to that. Okay, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.